I don't really know how long this series is going to go. I don't really, it might take the rest of the summer, but I want to go across this idea, is good enough? Is good enough? Right? And so we're gonna catch a scripture, but I'm then going to go back and kind of explain it. But we're going to start out in 2 Samuel chapter 12. 2 Samuel chapter 12 is where we're going to begin in verse number 1 all the way through verse number 7. And I know it's not going to make 100% sense, but it will as we move along in the sermon, so just know. So the Lord sent Nathan the prophet to tell David this story. There were two men in a certain town. One was rich and one was poor. The rich man owned a great many sheep and cattle. The poor man owned nothing but one little lamb that he had bought. And he raised this little lamb, and it grew up with his children, and it ate from the man's own plate and drank from his cup. Listen, I don't know about y'all, but I know people who have dogs that let them eat off their plate and drink out of their drink, and that's disgusting, okay? I'm just going to tell you, like, I don't care if Mary had a little lamb. It ain't eating off my plate and out of my cup, okay? Like, it's got its own place. All right? But this man loved this little lamb, and so he obviously let it eat off of his plate. And he cuddled it in his arms like a baby daughter. And it says this in verse 4, one day a guest arrived at the home of the rich man, but instead of killing an animal from his own flock or herd, because he had a lot, right? He goes and he takes the poor man's lamb and he killed it and prepared it for his guest. Like, imagine the devastation there, right? Like, you've cuddled this thing, you've allowed it to eat and drink from your plate and your cup, and you've raised it like it's one of your kids, and then this rich man just comes in and is like, I'm going to take that, and just kills it right there. Like, you'd be like, devastation, right? Like, this is like a sad ending to a romantic movie, right? Like this romance between the little lamb and some guy. We'll just call it sheepish love. There we go. So then at this moment, Nathan the prophet ends this story in verse 5. It says, David was furious. As you can imagine, like, David, remember, here was a shepherd, right? David took care of the lambs. He was a shepherd growing up. God found him in the shepherd field. He served in the shepherd field. Like, David cared about every lamb that he ever tended to. He killed lions. He killed bears to protect them. And here Nathan comes in with this story about a lamb, and he's like, what? Nuh-uh. No way. And he says, as surely as the Lord lives, any man who would do such a thing deserves to die. He must repay 4 lambs to the poor man for the one that he stole and for having no pity. And then Nathan looks at David and he says this, you are the man. You are the man. David's life was dripping with favor, right? We just got done our favor series, our camp series, and all these things, and we've gone through the life of David pretty much as we've gone through it, and David's life was dripping in favor. Point number 1 tonight is this: defined by good. Defined by good. And if there was anything that would define David, it would be this: good. Right? He was the shepherd boy who was neglected by his own family, but God saw and called the prophet Samuel to go there and to anoint him as the future king. That's David. David played the harp, and the demonic spirits left Saul alone for a little bit. Why? Because it said he was filled with the Spirit and had the anointing of God, the favor of God upon him. David killed Goliath. The greatest story in all of history. The greatest story in the Bible. David slays this giant, 9-foot giant, little boy David, and he kills him with a stone. Not even a sword. And then as the story progresses, David becomes king over Israel, God's chosen people. That's a big deal, right? David brings the ark back to Jerusalem, and if you remember, he danced with all his might. He gave it all his worship. He danced before the Lord, and Michal, his wife, said, listen, how dare you as king do that? He said, listen, I'll become even more undignified than this. Like, I don't care what people think about me. Everything I do is unto the Lord. This is David. He's a mighty warrior. Right? David was an exceptional warrior. He had plenty of warriors that would follow him and were a part of his mighty little army. And they took up for him, and he won many wars. He was a psalmist. He wrote a good majority of the book of Psalms. David was a worshiper. In the pasture, when nobody was around, he played his harp and he worshiped the Lord. He, before the Ark of the Covenant, as it's entering Jerusalem, worshipped with all his might. He was a worshiper. But most importantly, he loved the Lord. David loved the Lord. Yeah. He loved him. He loved him. He was defined by good. Everything in David's life is good. Everything in David's life points to that he knew the Lord, that he had a good relationship with the Lord. He had a good standing. See, listen, we live in the South, in case y'all didn't know. Listen, I don't remember who I told, I think it was Seth, as we were passing when I went to go get water. I said, listen, I might just preach on hell tonight and just open the door and say, if you want to go there, go outside and you'll experience it. But if you want heaven, stay in here and seek after Jesus. But I'm not going to do that. Right? But we live in the South, and you know, the majority of the South is the Bible Belt. I'm just going to put that in quotations, okay? We in the Bible Belt, right? Everybody's granny went to church. Everybody's granny made them go to church. Every granny prays. Every granny has Sunday supper at their house. Every granny, like, y'all know what I'm talking about, right? And it may not be in your life, but there might be one of your friends you know for sure that's what happened in their life, right? And so everybody in the South, like, we use these terms like, that's a good old boy. Y'all ever heard that term? Like, he's a good old boy. Right? And sometimes we use that term as in, like, they go to church, they're in good standing in the community, they're very loving, like they're a good person. That's a good old boy, right? But we use this term a lot, like we look at people and say they're good. Like they're a good person, right? Like, well, they go to church. That signifies a good person to me, right? They love the Lord. They pay their tithes. Right? Like, these are the things that we use to define people, but sometimes it doesn't even have to do with church. Sometimes we tell people are good because they're givers. Right? Have you ever met somebody that give you the shirt off their back, literally? Like, somebody who would give up their time and their money to help you or to help anybody? Like, listen, I know people like that they'll give the shirt off their back. They'll do anything for anybody to help them out because they love. They're a giver. They love people. And we would say, that's a good man. That's a good woman. Like, those are good people. Y'all ever heard that term? Like, they're good people. Right? When we were moving to our house, we kept hearing like, oh, y'all have some good neighbors. Y'all got some good neighbors. Like, they're good. Right? That's the word that we use to describe it. We do have good neighbors. I'm not saying that at all. We do. 100%. But we hear this term good, right? Yeah. And we use it to define people. But the problem is we're looking at the outward appearance of people, right? We're looking at the appearance of them in front of everybody else. Sometimes we're looking at people's social media, their highlight reel of life, and it's the things that they want you to see, right? Listen, I just posted our 7-year anniversary post on Monday, and it was real sweet, right? It was real sweet. But it does not, listen, I want y'all to see that I love Miss Lindsay, because I do. But it doesn't show the fights that we had the week before. Y'all know what I'm talking about? Like, I don't put that on social media. I don't put every disagreement we ever had. Right? JoJo's to the point now where we're like just trying to talk about something, and she's like, stop fighting. We're like, we're not even fighting, we're just talking. Y'all ever done that before? Like, you're like, they're fighting, and we're not, we're just talking, right? We're just having a conversation. But I'm not going to put those conversations on social media unless it's a big topic. Like, there are some people that do. They put every bit of their life on social media. I'm like, y'all need to, somebody take their password and change it so they don't know, because they don't need it. Right? But here's the thing. Everything can look good on the outside. Everything can be good. They can show you what they want, and we can see them as a good person. But here's the reality. David was a good man. David was a godly man. But somewhere in his life, he got comfortable. He got comfortable, and all of a sudden, he became defined by failure. And there's a lot of people that we think are good people, but on the inside, they're not so good on the inside. Listen, I've watched enough episodes of Criminal Minds where there were some episodes of people who were serial killers and things like that, and they look good on it. They're like good standing in the community, like people love them, and secretly they were killing people at night. And people would have called them good. Like, people would have said, that's a good person. Like, they're for sure going to heaven. But their heart was saying something else. And the problem is we look at people and we look at the appearance that's there, and we say they're good, right? But in reality, sometimes we have failure. And David got comfortable. And even though he had all these great things, and even though he's mentioned in the Bible in over 900 verses, over 900 verses in the Bible talk about David. Like, that's a lot of verses about one person. Right? I'm sure Jesus probably has way more, but David's got a lot. And most of the time, David is defined by 3 verses out of the 900, and it's when he had his biggest failure. In 2 Samuel chapter 11, David makes the biggest mistake he has ever made. Yeah. And he tries to cover it up. He fails. Okay? So this is what happens, to just kind of give you the story, the rundown. You can go back and read it if you want. I actually highly suggest you read it. Make sure I'm telling you the truth. Okay? But David, it says, was supposed to be at war, and he decided to stay home, and so he's back at his castle, and back then the castle would have been the highest place, and so he could look down across the whole city. And so David is walking about on his porch, and he's hanging out, and all of a sudden, back then, they didn't have indoor plumbing, and so the bathtub was on the roof, and so this beautiful lady is taking a bath, and he happens to look over, and he says, man, she's fine. And he said, he finds out from, he probably did this sneakily. He probably wasn't one like, hey, servant, who's that naked girl over there? He probably was like, hey, there's a house, and I'm, like, after the fact, he's probably like, see that house over there? Who lives there? I'm just curious, like, there's something about that house. I need to know who lives there, right? And so he finds out that it's this woman named Bathsheba, and her husband is one of the warriors in the army, and David sends for Bathsheba to come so he can meet her. And he just takes advantage of her completely. Like, I don't know, if you're king and you start pursuing somebody, I think you kind of feel like you're obligated at that point. So I would just call it rape. That's what I would call it. David does that. And then he just lets her go about her business. He's like, okay, we're good. I'm done with you. So she goes back to her house. And then not long after that, she sends word to him and says, by the way, I'm pregnant. All right, like, this is 90 Day Fiance all over again. And so David's like, uh-oh, I made a mistake. Duh. Right? And so what he does is he calls Uriah out of the battle, and he says, Uriah, I need you to come to the castle. I need to talk with you. And he talks with him, and he says, okay, now go home before I send you back to the battlefield tomorrow. And he comes to find out the next morning Uriah didn't go to the battlefield. He stayed on the palace steps and slept. And he's like, Uriah, why didn't you go home? Man, go spend some time with your wife. Wink, wink. And Uriah's like, listen, my compadres, my fellow brothers in the army, listen, they're not at home. They're not getting to spend time with their wives. They're not getting to enjoy a meal, so neither am I. I'm going to stay right here. And so David gets him drunk, thinking that's going to work. And it doesn't work either. So what David comes up with is he writes a letter, and he sends Uriah with this letter that goes to the commander and says, put Uriah at the forefront of the battle and then pull back and let him die. Can you imagine holding your own death letter? That's what Uriah did. David gave him the letter that was going to end up killing him, and he had no clue. And so then after all this, Uriah is killed, and David then pulls Bathsheba in and marries her. And she has this child. And here is in this moment when Nathan comes in and tells him this story about Mary had a little lamb. And David's like, no, that man should die. And Nathan says, you're the man. You're defined by failure. You thought you were good, David, but you got comfortable and you messed up. And you are now defined by failure. See, the law, if you were to follow the law in the Bible, the law of Moses, David should have been killed for his actions. It didn't matter that he's king. He should have been killed for his actions. That's what the law states. But God showed mercy to David. And in fact, I almost feel like it ended up a little bit worse for David because he now had to suffer with the consequences of his actions. Because God's favor was now ripped off of David because he failed. God took the favor off of his life. In fact, he had a messed up, jacked up family from then on out. And if you want to listen, if you want the details, I'm telling you. TV and movies don't even do justice to what happened to David's family afterwards. You're going to have to read it. But they lose the child. They lose this child that Bathsheba's carrying. And David is broken by it. And see, I'm here to tell you, sometimes society will try to define us. Culture will try to direct us, right? We'll feel like a failure. Y'all ever felt like a failure before? You ever felt like you weren't living up to your full potential? You ever feel like you were letting people down, right? Have your parents ever got on to you about not making high enough grades? Listen, I was not smart. Like if I made a B, I was good. Like there were certain, like math, A, every time, didn't matter what class. Okay, I just aced math. Math was my thing. But English, if I walked out with a C, that was good, right? But I had parents that were like, come on, you gotta do better than that. Listen, I'm giving it my best. My teacher's a terrible teacher. What do you want me to say? She doesn't like me. It's not my fault. Right, we try to make excuses. But there are times when, listen, I'm floating D and a little bit lower, right? And my parents are like, come on, you're acting like a failure. You're better than that. Right? Have you ever felt like a failure? And then there's sometimes when culture begins to direct us, right? And we start to feel like if we're not acting a certain way, we're a failure. Right? Like if we don't go to the parties like everybody else, we're a failure, and we don't line up with everybody. We don't fit in. If we're not doing what everybody else is doing, we're a failure, and everybody's looking at us and they're making fun of you because you're different. Listen, I was in high school, and I don't know about you, but at senior year, you know, they give you all the like most likely to do this and most likely to do that. You know what I got? Most unique. I just think people hated me and they didn't know what else. They're like, this dude's weird. Let's just give him this, right? Congratulations. Right. I'm just like, all right. I got that and the one that everybody else gets, which is most likely to succeed. Class of 2007. Right? And we all take this picture, but I'm like, listen, I'm the unique one. Why? Because I had long hair, and I was a rocker kid in the South. It just didn't line up, right? But you begin to feel like a failure. Maybe you've lived for God. You've loved God, and you find yourself entering into a lifestyle of sin. And I'll just tell you, the enemy is not going to let up. He's going to make you feel like a failure. He's going to tell you, how dare you? God did everything for you. How dare you? And you all of a sudden walk in all this guilt and all this shame and all this stuff is following you. And this idea of you're a failure. God can never use you. God will never use you because you're a failure. Society has tried to define you. Culture has tried to direct you. But I'm here to tell you that God is the one who created you. And so my third point tonight is this. You are defined by Christ. Defined by Christ. A psalm David wrote after Nathan calls him out is Psalms 51. And I've used this scripture in prayer a lot. Okay? When I first got saved, I didn't really know. I'm just going to be a little vulnerable for just a moment, if that's okay.